Welcome back. So back in 2016, when this channel started to become what it is now, the first debate that I had with somebody in the famous comment section was, what does a successful season look like? And the argument from the person I was talking to was Stanley Cup. Anything less than the Stanley Cup is not a success. But over the last 8 years since that debate took place, it's interesting because we still have this debate over what a successful season looks like. And I think for each team, success is different. And I think, yes, the ultimate is holding up the Stanley Cup at the end of the year, but you can still knock those down, can't you? And of the four teams that are remaining, I think any of the four would make a perfectly suitable Stanley Cup champion, but there will be an argument against any of the four. I don't know what that argument's necessarily going to be once we get there, but there's almost always an argument, right? So going back to 2016 and 2017, the first two Stanley Cups won during this channel's existence as a hockey channel, and the argument was that the NHL clearly favors Sidney Crosby and the Penguins, and I still see that. The NHL favors the Penguins, even though they've missed the playoffs just barely the last 2 years. So if the NHL was going to favor them, you would think they would have given them enough points to make it to the Stanley Cup playoffs over the last couple of seasons. And there were some calls that were a bit of head scratchers in the 2017 final. Specifically, I remember a couple, but Pittsburgh Stanley Cup wins. I don't think you can take it away from them. People will try. Like in 2018, when the Washington Capitals were against Tampa Bay in the conference final, what I remember that year was the argument being, well, clearly it's in favor of Tampa because the league wanted Tampa to win it. And then when it was clear Washington was going to win the series, then it became, well, yeah, the NHL wants Washington to win it because they want Ovechkin to have a Stanley Cup. So the argument was, well, the Caps win, yeah, but I mean, it's the NHL made that happen. And so that seems to be the argument that when a Stanley Cup champion is crowned, well, yeah, but that's what the NHL wanted to happen. But 2019 seems to kind of go against that because the St. Louis Blues and the amazing run they had, totally unforeseen. Nobody saw that coming, and yet the argument then gets made of, well, that was a fluke, and that's where that can come in. Well, that was a fluke. They were a team that got hot at the right time, not necessarily the best team, right? So you can knock down the success of any team, any Cup champion, Tampa Bay, and I'm sure there's plenty of people. Oh, those cups don't count. Those cups don't count. They don't. Like that's a thing. Like the NHL players decided, well, these cups don't count, so we'll just let Tampa have it. 2022, the Avs, well, there were certain calls during that run to the Stanley Cup championship for the Avs that people point at and say, well, no, the Avs didn't actually win. Remember the series with the Blues? That was ugly. And so the argument was, well, they shouldn't have passed the Blues, so clearly it's not a legitimate win. And then Vegas. And I feel like I don't even have to say much with Vegas other than Vegas. They went in 2023, and some hockey fans didn't agree that they should have been the Stanley Cup champion. And so you can knock down the success of a cup win apparently pretty easily because just going through these cup champions, that was pretty simple. And so again, this year, and it feels like even though there's been a lot of drama with certain series and certain games, that the four teams that are still standing, there's less drama associated with them, I feel like, than there has been with other teams. I don't feel like there's the same level of dislike towards the four teams that are still standing as there was for some of the Stanley Cup champions on the board. But we're only halfway through the playoffs, right? We'll see what happens in the conference finals and then the final to really stoke that I don't like that team, therefore, and find a reason why that's not success. So what about finishing first overall? Well, see, people were laughing when they saw that column before I even mentioned it. The Capitals, 2016 and 2017, they win the President's Trophy, finishing first overall. They win the Stanley Cup in 2018. So best team, however, they just won that cup because of Ovechkin. 2018, Nashville goes and wins the President's Trophy. That's after they went on a nice Cinderella run in 2017, which we'll get to. But again, they lost in the second round. 2019, it was famously Tampa before they won their Stanley Cup championships in 2020 and 2021. 2021, it was Colorado before they won their Stanley Cup in 2022. 2022, it was Florida. They went to the Stanley Cup final in 2023. And in 2023, it was Boston who had their nice centennial jerseys this year. Everybody seems to like those, so good on Boston for that. So finishing first overall is, you can look at that and say that's a successful season, but then people will point and go, well, yeah, President's Trophy curse. So wipes out any talk of success. And again, with Boston and their loss in the first round, I get it. I totally get it. I totally understand. What about the Cinderella run, though? Is that a successful season? So 2016, it was San Jose. After a lot of teams that they had before that may have been more talented but didn't get to the final, the 2016 team did. I'll say that qualifies as a successful season, although they didn't go back to the Stanley Cup final after that. 2017 Nashville, they were a wild card. They went all the way to the Stanley Cup final. Gave Pittsburgh a bit of a fight, at least when they were in Nashville, and Pittsburgh less of a fight there. And then for me, 2018, I couldn't find one where I said that's a true Cinderella run. I know Vegas fans are going to be like, hey, we had a Cinderella run. They finished first in their division just because people didn't think they were going to go that far in the playoffs. To me, a Cinderella run isn't a team that wins their division. Carolina in 2019 to me qualifies because they were a wild card team and they went all the way to the conference final. They got swept by Boston there, but that was a good little run for them. 2020, the New York Islanders, they were a 6th seed in the East, and they go all the way to the Eastern Conference Final. And they would have been the Cinderella run in 2021 as well, other than Montreal, going all the way to the Stanley Cup Final after winning less than half of their games during that 56-game schedule. That was an incredible run nobody saw coming. And then 2022, I didn't see one that I felt like was a true Cinderella run. But last year, Florida, to me, qualifies. Not a lot was expected of Florida going into those playoffs. They were against the juggernaut Bruins in the first round, and they were behind 3-1 in the first round. Not many people gave them a chance to come back and win that series, and then they did, and they went all the way to the conference final. So, or the finals. They're in the conference final now. See, this is where it gets tricky because the playoffs are still going on, messing with my brain a little bit. But there's a lot of questions, too, about, okay, so a successful season, what does it look like? Well, what if a team's rebuilding? What does it look like? So is it just acquiring picks and prospects, and is it just looking at the trades and going, well, they won that, they lost that? Because I've mentioned before that there's certain perils of, look at any video, any trade video, and you're going to find people that absolutely nail it and go, this is a good trade or a bad trade, and they're right. You're going to find plenty of people as well that immediately declare a winner or a loser, and they're wrong. And they're proven wrong sometimes very, very quickly. That guy's going to be great, and now they're a favorite for the Stanley Cup, and they're out in the first round, that kind of thing, right? And the other thing when we get into the rebuild side of things, and something I've found interesting is just how quickly a rebuild gets scrutinized. In today's National Hockey League, where only half of 32 teams make the Stanley Cup playoffs, it's tough because you're stripping it down. So when they do the rebuild and they do the full teardown, you're setting yourself up for years of mediocrity. Years of trying to build that back up and get back into contention. For the teams that just move a couple of key guys and do like a quick little retool, they can be back in the playoffs relatively quickly. But for that full rebuild, it's tough. And there are teams that have a hard time getting out of that rebuild process. So I do find it interesting how quickly they're scrutinized. One thing I look for in a rebuild is, are they getting better year after year? And if the answer is yes, then I think it's too early to declare that rebuild's been a failure. But there's one that I keep seeing people talk about as a failure, and I kind of shrug my shoulders and go, I don't know how. So if I'm making the argument, and I've got the 31 teams that I can make an argument for success or not success with, and then there's a team that's moved. So it's hard to argue that they've had any level of success when they're no longer going to be playing where they were this past season. But the seasons I would argue are a success are as follows, in alphabetical order. Boston, with the loss of Bergeron and Krejci, the fact that they finished with 109 points, they played as well as they did throughout most of the regular season. I think that was a success. Yes, they were out in the first round. They did get out of the first round. They were out in the second round. They got through the first round. But I still qualify that as a success, comparatively speaking, with what was the expectation coming into the season. Carolina, I think it's a success. I know for Carolina fans, you may not feel like it's a success. They're out in the second round, but they had a very strong regular season. They've kept Rod Brind'Amour now. They still have a very good young team. I think on some level, obviously, being out as early as they are in these playoffs is a disappointment. I would still say the season as a whole is a success. Chicago, relatively, a success. This is that tear-down rebuild, right? And so the rebuild starts this season towards the end of the year where you see Nazar coming in and you've got Bedard playing really well. You've got Korchinski on the point. You've got Vlasic. There's some really good young players starting to come into that lineup for Chicago. I would say there's some success as a result. Colorado, I would still say is a success. No, they did not win the Stanley Cup. I would still say this season was a success. And again, if not for what happened with Nichushkin and Taves missing that one game, who knows? Maybe they do end up knocking out Dallas. Maybe they would still be in the playoffs. Dallas, they're in the Final Four. I think this has been a successful season for them. Whether they go to the Stanley Cup final or not, I would argue the season's already been a success. Detroit, and this is where the argument comes in, right? Of, oh, they're still not in the playoffs. It's been a failure. But they've got better every year, and they're a lot closer to the playoffs this year than they were last year, than they've been in a very long time. They put up their best points total since, 2015? So this is a team that is trending in the right direction. I know the disappointment at the end of the season, but the overall season, when you look at it, I think was a success for Detroit. They were still mathematically alive right up until the very end. Edmonton, absolutely a huge success for them this season. Again, it doesn't matter whether they win the round that they're in against Dallas. I think this season's already been a success because they're in the conference final for the second time in 3 years. Florida, Florida clearly a success for them as well. Again, President's Trophy winner in 2022, finalist in 2023, and could go right back to the final this year. Montreal, I would say with their rebuild, I think it's been a success thus far. They were a better team this year than they were expected to be, and they've got a lot of their good young guys in the lineup. Plus, Slavkovsky took that next step in the second half of this season. I think Montreal's going to be somewhat dangerous next season. Nashville wasn't expected to make the playoffs. I think this was a successful season for them as well. And now they've traded out McDonough's cap hit. They've got a lot of cap space this summer. Should be fascinating to watch. The Rangers, they're in the Final Four. I think the Rangers have had a successful season as well. Really strong run. Nice bounce back from Shesterkin after a down season by his standard last year. San Jose, I think, had a successful season. I also don't hate the Hurdle deal. I've talked about that before, but I think the Hurdle deal was one that I think could backfire on Vegas, to be honest. That's a pretty decent cap hit for a long time to come yet. So I do think San Jose dumping off that contract could end up being a success. But just the fact they've got all the prospects they have now, plus they've got the number 1 draft pick. They're going to draft Macklin Celebrini. That's a successful season by San Jose standards. For Vancouver, we're in Vancouver. I've always said that the key to showing who the fans are the ones that don't take their flags off their vehicle as soon as the team's out of the playoffs, who don't stop wearing the jersey just because the team's out of the playoffs. I've always been a big proponent of wearing the Canucks gear when the Canucks are eliminated, because that's kind of the tradition that I have. I don't want it to be a tradition. I want the tradition to become one of, and they won the Stanley Cup, and I get to wear this. But the Capitals, I would say, had a successful season as well, making the playoffs when nobody expected them to. And this is where it gets tricky, because if you're a Capitals fan that believes this team needed to do some kind of retool or rebuild, and that this playoff appearance is kind of a whoops as a result of the team playing, really, really well in close games, and you may feel like this season wasn't a success because they didn't have the prospects and the draft picks you might want them to. But I would argue the season on the ice was a success for the team. And then there's the arguable. Anaheim. Anaheim had the strong start, and then they fell apart. But they're still technically in the rebuild. Carlson gets into the lineup. A lot of injury problems for them this season. They do improve a little bit. I think it was, a 1 or a 2 point improvement for them this year. Mild improvement, so 30 years from now they're in the playoffs kind of thing. But I think Anaheim, you can make the argument. You can make the argument for Calgary. Do they fail to make the playoffs? Yes. Do they make sure they get something back for their pending UFAs? Also, yes. Kuzmenko fit in well. I think that deal worked out for both teams. Lindholm was good for the Canucks in the playoffs. That's where they needed him. I think on a level that I don't know that Kuzmenko would have been. And so I think that worked out well for Calgary. I think the Hanifin deal was good for Calgary. They've done a good job with what they have, and you can still make the argument that they could be a dark horse to make the playoffs next season in the West. So that's all important to look at with Calgary. The Islanders, arguable, because they make the playoffs. Yes, they get taken out in the first round. Patrick Waugh being the coach and all that, but is this a team that's going to have more success next year? We shall see. I could have put them under success, but because they're out in the first round. I don't know. I don't know if that's again arguable for that reason, right? Philadelphia. I would argue Philadelphia had a successful season. Nothing was expected of Philadelphia this year. Nothing. And the fact that they were as close to the playoffs as they were, I think is a testament to the coaching of John Tortorella, to the team putting together a roster that's good enough to stay in the hunt for that long. And Philadelphia is going to be interesting to watch this summer as well. St. Louis, nothing was expected of St. Louis this year. During the fall, especially in the analytics community, they were buried. They were done. Just St. Louis, not much of a present, not much of a future. This is a team that's trending in the wrong direction, and yet they were right in the hunt for a playoff spot till the end. Vegas, you can make the argument. Now, Vegas goes out in the first round. They're defending Stanley Cup champions, so it is hard to make an argument that it's a really successful season. However, with all the injuries they went through this year, and whatever your opinion is of how many players were out of the lineup, the fact that their best two-way forward, Mark Stone, missed as much time as he did, and they still made the playoffs, I think is something, considering some of the depth that's been shed over the last couple of years. And we'll see what happens with this team this offseason as well. But I would argue you could say it was a good season. Successful for them. Winnipeg, the argument can be made as well. Again, being out in the first round puts it into arguable rather than success. In the event that Winnipeg had won that series over Colorado, even if they lose against Dallas, I would have it as a success, saying they knocked out a team that won the Cup just a couple years ago. But the way that they lost that series, it drops into arguable. And then the ones that are really difficult to argue, Buffalo. What are you doing? Last year, things were getting better for Buffalo. Last year, I could have Buffalo under success. They were right there until the end. This year, no. Columbus, it's hard to argue Columbus. Apparently, it's hard for me to spit out with the word Columbus. But yeah, Columbus, it's tough to argue any kind of success there. The GM's gone. I don't know what that team's going to look like next year. LA, it's tough to argue because they lose against Edmonton for the third year in a row. And it just doesn't feel like they're getting any further ahead. It feels like the Dubois trade may not have been beneficial to the team overall. Minnesota, it's tough to argue as well. There will be, I debated about whether to put them under hard to argue or arguable. Minnesota, I guess you could make the argument based on the cap penalty number being as high as they are, the fact they stay in the hunt as long as they did, is a testament to the strength of the team. My answer to that, though, would be that the team still had its failings, and going into next season, they're still dealing with the cap penalty problem. We'll see how it goes. New Jersey, I don't think an argument can be made. New Jersey had a successful season. I don't think it can be made. The Ottawa Senators, yeah, same thing. I don't know that an argument can be made for the Sens either. I would say no. Pittsburgh, they acquired Erik Karlsson to not miss the playoffs. So the Karlsson acquisition and then the just missing the playoffs again, in fact, a little bit further out of the playoffs this year than last year. I don't think you can argue success there. Seattle, going into the playoffs in year 2, falling back out in year 3. It's not devastating. It's not the end of the world, of course, because it is just year 3, but it is hard to argue it's a successful season. Tampa Bay being out for the second year in a row in the first round. Hard to argue a successful season there as the core gets another year older. And Toronto. It is virtually impossible to argue that Toronto had a successful season when they go out in the first round again. And it looks like they haven't made any progress from where they were in, say, 2018. But the reality is that this team is still, going to be in the mix next year. And maybe they end up in the success area for next season. And again, Arizona moved to Utah. They had an up and down season on the ice, and the move to Utah means I cannot argue success. What a successful season would look like for Utah, we'll see what they do in the offseason. If they're aggressive and they spend money and they improve the roster, expectations are going to be higher. Other than that, I don't know that the expectations are going to be very high at all. But let me know your thoughts. What to you qualifies as a successful season in the National Hockey League, or is it just Stanley Cup or nothing else? Let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.